Welcome to Hitting Home. I'm your host, Megan Driscoll.
And I'm Becky Coletta.
And we are here to break down how decisions in D.C. affect our local communities.
Because all politics are local politics.
Welcome to Hitting Home. We are here again today, Megan and Becky.
Hi, Megan.
How are you?
Okay, how are you?
I'm well. So today we are going to talk about overrides. There are quite a few towns in Massachusetts who've already faced this challenge. There are many more towns ahead that will be facing it, and there are several towns who have tried to pass an override. It has failed, either at the town meeting or at the subsequent vote, and they'll be back at it. So we thought it was a really relevant topic and timely, and it does have some strong connections to sort of the national conversation that we want to talk about, like how national politics are really affecting each individual local organization's.
Yeah, I think it's both. It's both. These things will become more difficult with the financing issues and the funding issues, and what we're going to talk about today, which is a little bit more thematic of how that discussion and those themes are hitting us here at home.
Exactly. So, it's fresh off the press that Duxbury just had their vote, and everybody probably knows I live in Duxbury. Duxbury has I think a population of 16,000. I think there are like 13,000 eligible voters. 4,000 people voted, which I know is a lot of people for a vote like this, but in my opinion, Duxbury hadn't had an override in 30 years, so this was a very low turnout, and the vote was the override lost by 200 points, by 200 people. And so I just want to talk a little bit about. I thought we could start off with we're fresh off the heels. I'm salty. I would say I'm salty.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm salty. So I want to talk about why are overrides happening. So I thought we could talk just a little bit about how do we fund government? How does local government get funded?
So it's a combination, right, of local property taxes and money from the state and federal government. And most of the federal money comes through the state. And
we've talked about that. We've talked about how specific funding comes through Title I for education, through IDEA funds.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that's what we're discussing.
And it also goes into the state coffers. A third of our state budget is federally funded. So money that we get is in part because we're getting funding from the federal government.
Exactly.
So we get Chapter 70 and Chapter 90 money, and that funds schools and roads in town. We get some, but a lot of our town budget is funded by property taxes.
And each town has a different makeup of that, right? So the more commercial you may have more commercial tax base, which is actually can produce more money for a town. Sometimes, you think about the town like a Hanover as an example, who has much more commercial tax revenue than a Duxbury, yet they're still facing an override. So it's not like the panacea is not just to...
Yeah, there's no single panacea.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the reality is towns set budgets based upon the mix of property they have and the mix of revenue they have, and then things happen, inflation happens, time happens.
But also just sort of the services that the town requires, right? So if the services are beyond, right, if you have a lot of really great services in town, and you have to fund those things, you have to fund them through taxes. So by, when you're not paying for that, when you're deciding that when you're no longer willing to fund that, is when we have to cut back on services, right? Because it's all based on tax revenue.
You either need to raise more money or cut back on services. And Massachusetts is a little bit different than other states. I mean, other states don't have quite the same cliff that we have with Prop 2.5, right?
So let's talk about a little bit, because people may not know what Prop 2.5 is. So let's just define what Prop 2.5 means.
So to be clear, Prop 2.5 goes to the pie that is the overall budget of the town. And Prop 2.5 says that pie can't increase by more than 2.5%. Can't increase by more than 2.5% per year, plus new growth. So people keep forgetting about the new growth, because that funded a lot of things that we did to get through other bad years with health insurance premiums, increases in pension obligations. So new growth is when you have a new subdivision, a new supermarket, those produce new tax growth.
Yep.
That's on top of the 2.5.
Yeah, but if you don't have any new growth.
But if you have no new growth, or if your new growth starts, like in Pembroke, where I live, the big subdivisions, we just don't have the land for that. So we'll eventually have a big development at the golf course that will add some new growth, probably starting next year. But but the subdivisions that took place between like 2000 and 2010 have slowed down.
Yeah, well, there's only so much land, right? You know, there's only so much that you
Right,
can do,
so like
right?
on the planning board, when I first got onto the planning board, we had a bunch of subdivisions that were finishing up. And then I spent 6 years on the planning board, and I'm trying to think, we might have had one small subdivision, and most of it was commercial site plans.
Yeah.
So Prop 2.5 is 2.5% plus new growth, but 2.5% is not locked in stone. What Prop 2.5 says is if the town believes that it needs more than 2.5%, it has to justify that to the voter, and it has to go to the vote.
AKA an override.
An override. and it has to do that for a debt exclusion or an override. So a debt exclusion says we're going to go over that 2.5% for a temporary period to fund a specific project that we're going to bond
Right,
out.
like a one-time thing.
Like a school.
Yep.
Or a police station.
Senior center.
Senior center.
Right, right.
And then an override is when you're going to raise the size of the pie, and then the 2.5% will be calculated on the new pie
On the new
size.
pie, exactly.
Assessments, people keep thinking, well, my assessed value went up, and that meant my taxes went up. If all the assessed values in town increased at exactly the same rate,
Yeah.
your assessed value would have no impact
Right.
on your taxes. Assessed values don't increase in a very uniform way, so
Right.
sometimes your taxes will go up more or less than 2.5%.
Yeah.
And that's really just because how your property fares in relation to the rest of the town.
Right, but that's separate. That's separate and apart from the 2.5% and the override issue.
But
so,
but the idea is that there has to be a valve because prices don't, costs don't increase at a set 2.5%.
well, exactly, and you'd have to be living underneath a brick, right, to not be aware of inflation, right?
Right.
So we have inflation that has outpaced 2%, and so this is why you're hearing about overrides. This is why we're doing the show, right? We're doing the show
Right.
because Duxbury is one of many towns that have had to approach this, and one of many more that are going to be approaching it in the next 12 months.
I heard there were up to 80 towns
80
that were
towns.
considering overrides this
exactly.
year.
And in fact, actually, I heard that from the fire chief in Duxbury. We were talking this past weekend, and he was saying how he's been actually reached out to by their association to talk about overrides in general because so many fire chiefs are going to be facing an override.
Right.
Okay, so let's just talk about what overrides often cover, right?
Right.
So we talk about, okay, so we've talked about taxes and roughly how they
Right.
calculate and
Right.
what they service, which is
Right.
everything in town. If you have a pool, if you have a library, you have your schools, you have your administration, you have your DPWs, you have your
Town
safety,
clerk, your animal
your
officer.
animal control officer, you name it. Those are the services that our taxes are funding. And those are the services that people who live in town get to decide they either want or don't want, right? They either value or don't value. And so an override really is how much do you value the services that your town is providing? Ultimately, it's a question of how much do you value those things?
Well, theoretically, that's what it really is.
Yeah.
But the chatter and the conversation becomes about something very different.
We'll talk about that. Yes, but that ultimately it is about funding the services in the town that historically the town has wanted to keep, right? So when town officials are coming, and let's talk a little bit about that. So how are overrides, who decides what an override is going to be? I understand it's a little bit different in certain towns. Like in Duxbury, as an example, it's a combination of the town manager working with the finance committee as well as select board. It's kind of like a grouping plus the school board as it relates to the schools.
So almost all towns in Massachusetts are broken up somewhat similarly.
Yeah.
In a town like Plymouth, you have a representative town government. In a city, you have a city council instead of a town meeting.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different in those towns in terms of the town meeting piece of it.
Yep.
But generally, your town manager or your mayor is in charge of coming up with a budget.
Yep.
Presenting it to the select board and your financial advisors. Any town that has a town meeting has either a finance committee or advisory committee or both.
Yep.
And those are just volunteers.
Right.
And usually you'll find people who have finance backgrounds or...
Yeah, they're usually, they're not for hacks. These are people who care and understand and get engaged and get involved.
Right. Yeah. And Duxbury, my husband's been on a finance committee when we were in Hanson.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time with budgets. So the select board goes line by line, department by department. The advisory digs in sometimes even deeper than the select board these days.
You mean the finance
committee
Yep.
or advisory, depending on the town.
Yep.
And they dig in a little bit deeper, and they'll call in people and say, okay, come in, talk to us, tell us why you need this money.
Yeah. So they're basically going through the process of justifying each of these line items, and this goes on for, in many cases, months and months.
Usually anywhere from 6 to 9 months, depending on the town.
Exactly. So once you get to for people to understand, once you actually get to an override vote, you have spent people in your town have spent 6 or 9 months breaking down the numbers, working through the process, getting an engagement, getting acceptance, working towards these numbers. This doesn't magically happen, right? This is something that's worked on over time.
And the way it works also is that the schools get their line item at town meeting is generally one line.
Yes.
And the lines within that get done at the school committee level between the superintendent and the school committee.
Exactly.
And generally, the school committee comes in and talks to finance and advisory to justify that big number.
Exactly.
And they can dive in as deep as they want to if the school committee wants their recommendation. So the idea of it is that town meeting needs advisors who are going to dig into the details to tell them and give them advice on whether they think this is a good idea or not.
Exactly.
Right? Because
Yes.
most of us don't have that much time.
Exactly. Well, and I think the other thing too about about coming to these numbers is that it's all very transparent. I mean, almost every town has these meetings that are online that show up on YouTube literally 24 hours after it's happened, which I think is amazing. There's actually a new Justin Evans from Whitman has put together an AI recap of every town's
Key meetings.
Key
So
meetings,
he'll take
yeah.
select board meetings or school board meetings,
summarize it.
yeah. And
So
he
helpful,
will
by the
edit
way.
it just to,
Yeah.
and so it's very helpful if you
called
don't have
South
time.
Shore News, I think.
South Shore News.
Yeah,
And so if you don't have time to watch the whole video, you get the recap.
Exactly, and I'm sure that he's looking to expand throughout the rest of the state too. This information is available, right? So
Right.
people can dig in, but ultimately they have to decide at a town meeting and then a secondary vote.
Right.
So it's usually a two-step process, which I actually think people take for granted or don't really understand the process, right? So months and months and months of planning and discussions and going through the numbers and transparency and open meetings and involvement from the town as much as anybody wants to be, which I find people are not as involved as they should be. We get to a final budget for an override. We have to pass it at town meeting, and then we have to pass it at the ballot box, essentially.
Yes.
And what actually happened in both the case of Duxbury and Hanover, and these are just two overrides recently, is that they passed at town meeting and then they lost at the ballot box.
Right.
Unfortunately.
And in both cases, it was the town all worked together and came up with a budget that everyone agreed upon. It was something that met the needs of the fire department, the police department, the school department, DPW, town hall services. And so in both Hanover and Duxbury's cases, they said, okay, we're not only going to look at an override that gets us through a year and then we're going to come back begging for more money. They said, what
Which,
do we...
by the way, I feel like they do pretty often in like a Hingham. I feel like Hingham has an override on like a very regular basis.
So it's a different approach,
It's a different
right?
approach. It's like and I think most towns approach it not like Hingham, more like Duxbury, where it's more of a long-term planning. I think in Duxbury's case, it was like a 5 to 10 year override, right? That this would last us. This $5 million they asked for was so that we didn't have to go back to taxpayers and ask again in another year or two.
And that's what...
and in our case, in Duxbury's
Pembroke
case,
did that back in, I think, 2015 or 2016. We had an override, and it was primarily for the schools, and there were a lot of school board meetings that had got a lot of parent involvement to look at why we needed it. So this...
And that goes to just the planning part, right? So when you look at a deficit, when you look at, okay, we as a town are going to be at a deficit of, let's say, $5 million over the next 5 years, it is up to the town manager, the select board, the finance to find ways to meet that need or to make those cuts if they have to, because they're really coming up with two budgets. They're coming up with a budget that's a deficit, right? The budget, so you're really choosing between the override is giving you the option of government A or government B, and government A is the government with the cuts, and then the government B is the government with the services as they've been given to you, and hopefully for a longer period than a year. So I hope people really understand that this is, when you go and you vote for an override, you're actually voting for cuts or no cuts, and the cuts are real. And so I think one of the things that happens is when you look at a budget and you are trying to you can't take all of the money from the schools, you can't take all of the money from fire and safety, you have to kind of spread it out. And I think in most cases that's what happens. So I think in Duxbury it was DPW, town staff, at the actual town hall. It was the school got killed. 18 teachers are going to have to, 18 staff will be walked out. I think it's 2 firefighters, 2 police officers. It was sort of dispersed. That was very similar to Hanover's too.
Right, but the thing that already has gotten confused in Duxbury is there were 2, was it firefighters who retired or police officers? So people are saying, oh, we didn't have to lay anyone off. You didn't lay anyone off, but you still lost those 2 positions.
Yeah, better to not have to lay someone off, but it doesn't make it doesn't make the override different.
Well, it doesn't.
I don't want to talk too much about Duxbury because it's just too specific. I mean, again, the override in Duxbury is over. It's not been passed. But more towns in the future are going to be facing this.
But I bring it up only because it goes to this idea of disinformation and mistrust,
well, let's talk about
which we're going to get
to talk about that. Yeah, we're
okay.
About that. So, so I hope we've really fully kind of described like how this process why is this important? Why is this happening? How do we fund our government? How do overrides occur? How does the money get determined? Right. Who gets to decide who gets cut? And so there are certain so we're going to talk about how do we get to an override passing or failing, right? So and I think the situation was similar in both Hanover and Duxbury that recently just had sort of a similar pattern.
And I think that in most towns that I've seen over time, like Hanson has had similar issues, Pembroke has had similar issues, Whitman is facing similar issues. Like this is not unique to one town or another. It's just we're talking a little bit from our experience, but you'll find that this conversation is very similar from town to town.
Yeah. So there's, we've kind of divided it into like, there are like 4 kinds of people, right? There's like 4 kinds of constituents.
We're a little jaded right now.
Yeah,
okay?
right. But I think everybody should be a little bit, I mean, not jaded, but everybody should be going into this with eyes wide open. Right? That number one, there are many, many, many people who are involved with deciding where these cuts should be made.
And most of them are volunteers.
Most of them are volunteers who work hours and hours and hours and hours, who know the systems better than anybody else. The system is transparent. If you want to get involved and you want to show up and you want to ask questions, it's available to you. Or if you just want to listen, there's endless amounts of information. If you want the information, it's going to be there. There's forums that usually, towns have. I think Duxbury had like 6 or 7 different forums.
You guys did more than I've seen in other towns.
Yeah, we really went crazy. But in most towns, there's ability to actually go interact with your elected and appointeds and be able to ask specific questions. So you get to this point where now you have the override, right? You have it. It's on the ballot. It's going to be a town meeting. You're going to have to go do this, and then you're going to have to do the ballot. And I find that there are like 4 kinds of people.
We came up with
4 kinds of people. Okay. The first kind is the uninterested. I call them lazy.
I'm
potentially
thinking that they
apathetic.
Less engaged,
nicer way of saying it, non-voter. Often somebody who doesn't volunteer on boards, doesn't really participate in local government, is not paying attention, sees it as like, really takes it for granted, ultimately.
Yeah,
and I think we all do that at certain parts of our time.
Yeah, I definitely have pieces of my life where I didn't pay attention to municipal politics because I was very busy in my professional life, or I was traveling a lot for work reasons. So, or there wasn't a lot of information available.
And I would say I was at one point, an uninterested party as well. I'm not. This isn't.
But I also wouldn't fault people who voted because I knew I had abdicated by not voting.
No,
so
that's
what's interesting is to have the people who don't vote and then complain.
Well, exactly. That's kind of the worst of the worst of the worst. Like you get what you get when you don't vote. Right? So, but that's a real problem. Like that group of people are the people that we have to get engaged because. As all,
It's a
all
lot of
politics are
people.
local politics. It's a lot of people.
Well, in Duxbury, that went from 10,000 voted in the presidential election
To 4.
to 4,000.
6,000 people who are voters. These are voting
Right.
population of people who just decided they weren't going to come. That's a lot of people to decide that this, which is basically we've defunded our government. We defunded our government in Duxbury. Hanover defunded their government, and 4,000 people who typically voted or voted 3 just didn't think it was important to vote on. So
6,000.
that's a lot. That's a lot of people. Okay. Then we have sort of this category of people that are fearful of losing something, like there's a real financial incentive for them. They may believe that the tax increase would eliminate their ability to stay in the town, for good or for right or wrong reasons, correct or incorrect. I think in Duxbury it was anywhere between like $30 to $80 to $90 per month additional that a house, that you would have to.
And for some people, that's real money.
Yeah.
What was interesting in Duxbury was seeing that more of the no votes came out of the 2 precincts that have some of the highest.
That's right. Yeah.
Highest, most valuable property.
I would say to that group of people, just be really careful, with your conversation around you can't afford it, because I always think how can the other question is, can you afford not to? Right? Can you afford not to pass this when it comes to losing firefighters, losing police, losing teachers? Like, those are the questions you really have to ask.
And losing the value of your community.
Yeah.
And also, if you're a senior and might one day need to sell, you may have diminished the value of your home.
Exactly.
And I think what we don't,
I think
we're
this is
scared to talk.
this is a misguided group.
Well, I also think we don't talk a lot about things like older people who could get a reverse mortgage. Reverse mortgages used to be horrible. They've gotten better, and they're not giving away your home. You can have a reverse mortgage and retain a lot of equity in your home.
Yeah, exactly.
And just take out just enough to get through taxes for the next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I do think that this group of people is, they're loud, they do speak up. I think they can be a little potentially misguided. I'm not saying that not everybody,
some people are really making difficult choices.
Yes.
But what was interesting that Duxbury did that a lot of towns have not done, it was a new thing to me.
Yes.
Is that Duxbury had a warrant article that passed that sets up a
town meeting.
Town meeting that sets up a special fund to collect extra money during tax season to help people stay in their homes.
Yep.
So in addition to abatement programs for seniors who are lower income, or at least in Duxbury, that's someone who makes less than $69,000 a year.
Yeah.
It allows for a gap to be filled in less definite ways. And so between reverse mortgages and that fund,
the fund kind of lost its momentum, apparently. I mean, people didn't really talk about that. I encourage towns that are facing an override to to think about that as an option. But if you are going to take the step to actually enact that and go to town meeting and vote in favor of that, then you do need to make sure that it gets disseminated out to the public and they know that it's available, because I just don't think, I didn't hear it come up a lot after the fact, with this group of loud people talking about how they couldn't afford to stay in their homes. And I just think there wasn't enough conversation about, what about a reverse mortgage? What about this fund that was set up? Things like that. And again, I also just want to question, can you afford not to? Can you afford not to have the fire department come to your house in 12 minutes? I mean, because they don't have a bus available, which again, fire and safety hugely, we defunded the police, which is insane. That's what, when a town decides that they are not going to pass the override, by the time it gets to that point, and you don't pass it, you are defunding your government as you know it. That's just a reality. So then I think then we have another group of people which we call sort of engaged. So I would say that's me at the moment. I would call myself engaged. You're engaged. We
I've
know
been
the
engaged
issues.
for the last 22 years around here.
I probably have been engaged for the last 5, maybe 10. But you get engaged, you go to things, you ask questions, you show up at forums, you listen, you read.
You know who's working in town hall. You know who's filling these positions.
Yep.
You know why they're getting paid what they're getting paid.
You look at the budget. Maybe you don't go through every line item, but you kind of, and I think there's this trust that after you look underneath the hood, that you feel good about it, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the thing. I think if the uninterested parties could look underneath the hood and see, they would feel motivated to go out and support the kind of work that's happening on their behalf to keep those services going, you know?
Right. Well, sometimes you'll see a line item and you'd say, why did that person's salary go up?
Yeah.
But if you were part of the discussions, you might realize, oh, that person came in as a complete administrative person. And then they started to take on more professional role. And then they started to take on a lot of additional duties.
Yeah.
And then you couldn't live without them. And then you compared them to someone doing those duties in another town, and you realize if they had come in at the level and the value they're really worth, and to keep them in that position, you need to bump their salary up.
Yeah. Well, it's all just about...
But you don't know that if you just look at the line item.
That's right. Or even if you don't take the next step to say, oh, did they do a salary review? Oh, they did do a salary review. Oh, was there... This should be audited. Oh, it does get audited. You know, again, if you take the step as opposed to the sort of an inflammatory response to something, it's like taking the next step to see, did that work actually get done? And it's like, oh, shocking. We do an audit every year. So, and then I think the final thing we want to talk about, we don't have a lot more time left, but I do want to talk about this DOGE influence. This like waste, fraud, and abuse has really infiltrated the conversations where people are immediately going to there's got to be waste, there's got to be abuse, that person's overpaid, there's bloat in that system. When you hear those kinds of comments, you know, that is, I think, a newer phenomenon.
Well, I can tell you that I started doing this work when I ran for the select board in Hanson in 2004. And the dialogue and the way people are approaching it is so much less community-based now than it was then.
Yep. And it's an us versus them. Like the government is taking advantage of us and they don't know what they're doing. And there's a lot of that kind of conversation happening online.
But I also know that in 2020, there's a group of people around us on the South Shore who got trained in how to be disruptive in local government. Mm-hmm. And I also look at the messages they're getting. So here's a quote from Steve Bannon. Populism is system versus anti-system. That's the whole story. Mm-hmm. It's all about anti.
Yeah.
It's not about building
breaking
community.
It down. No, it's breaking it down.
It's breaking it down. It's not about what we love. It's not about what we value. In 2004, we had Republicans and Democrats working together on these overrides because, and to some extent we still do, but it's less so when you're talking about the people who are supporting the Doge movement or the MAGA movement, because I think they're being taught to distrust and not believe.
Distrust everything.
Distrust everything.
And distrust of things that are online available for you to actually go and look under the hood and see, and not believing with their own eyes. There's a lot of that. So when you
not
start
believing what your eyes tell you, what you see,
it's really a lot of gaslighting. But yes, I think that needs to be hit so hard against. Like that's what I see. If we have to push back on that kind of behavior because it's also laced with a ton of online bigotry, misogyny,
fear of other,
a lot of like people talking to people the way they would keyboard warrioring. I mean, people would never speak to your face this way.
No. And they really wouldn't.
No, I don't think so. So,
and also what's really interesting to me is when some of those people actually finally get a position in local government, they're supporting the budget. Yeah. Because they've been through line by line and they can't find the savings. There's no magic that you're going to slash, we're going to slash someone in the town clerk's office and we're going to have one person in the town clerk's office, or we're going to slash someone in the treasurer collector's office that's already working with limited staff. Yeah.
It's just about,
it's not magic.
No, it's not magic. So I think what we want to end with essentially is we've given you a lot of opinions today, but we've also given you quite a bit of information about like how this whole thing works. And the question really is like, what kind of avatar are you? Are you uninterested? Are you maybe thinking about things from a financial perspective that doesn't in the end help you as it relates to the override? Are you engaged? Fantastic. And then if you are in this category of Doge MAGA, right? I'm not sure that we can reach them, but can we engage the other three populations to kind of fight back against that? Well, and I think what we want to know is, or sort of a call to action is, join a board. Right, run for something. A lot of these boards are essentially a talent bank. Fill out a talent bank, in your town, and get involved. Watch the select board meetings online. Watch the finance committee meetings online. Pull the documents off of the website. Really become that engaged, informed constituent.
And I also challenge people to think about, what is your vision?
Yeah.
What is your vision for your community?
Yeah.
The language that's coming from the top, and the language I think we need to counter with locally, is what is our vision for our communities?
Exactly.
Where do we want to live? What do we want life to be like?
Yeah.
Is it a dog-eat-dog world, or are we working together to build better spaces to live in?
Yeah, exactly.
And try to work on that for yourself.
Yeah. So I encourage everybody to sort of think about what their avatar is. Let us know what your avatar is. And also just kind of let us know if your town is coming up against an override, right? Because I think that we want to hear, and if we can provide any guidance or understanding about what might needs to happen in order to
Message us.
Yeah, message us for sure. We want to hear about it. Great. Well, thanks for listening to Hitting Home. We appreciate it. See you next week.